Hi, I'm Gareth Smith. I'm going to talk about Raging Speedon's debut album, Raging Speedon. Raging Speedhorn are spear-chucking, hobo-humping, weed-smoking, glue sniffers who killed Elvis, Kenny and Kennedy. Broke strings, blue heads, kissed ass, sold out, washed a dog, stole your drugs, clothes, money and women, sold their souls to the devil and John Denver. I know everything without question to Huggy Bear and Leo Sayer. When I first looked at it, I was like, what is this nonsense kind of thing? I remember Tony reading this for some promo video or something. I think we were on tour in Japan or something at the time, and we were just like stood behind him looking dumb and stupid, and yeah, so it sounded like something Tony could have written. But when I actually look at it, there are some things which maybe are quite accurate. We definitely broke a lot of strings. We definitely smoked a lot of weed. We didn't kill Elvis, but and I don't think we sniffed glue, but there was a lot of glue sniffing in our hometown. We definitely sold stuff, and yeah, we could say we sold our souls as well, because maybe we did. We got hooked up to a pretty big record label anyway, and that was never the goal from the beginning. But yeah. We started the band in 98, me, guitar, Tony Loughlin, guitar, his brother John Loughlin on vocals, Frank Regan vocals, Darren Smith bass, and Gordon Morrison on drums. All 6 guys come from Corby. Corby is a town of about 60,000 people in the Midlands in England, and it was an old steel town. Pretty much my entire family worked there, steel workers. The rest of the guys' families, fathers, dads did as well, I'm sure. Everybody worked there. It was like half the town worked there. And then, like somewhere in the early 80s, the steelworks closed down, which left the town in mass unemployment and a lot of social misery, a lot of unemployment, a lot of alcoholism, substance abuse. And yeah, it was a pretty depressing place to grow up, which... You know, when you're a kid, you don't really think about it that much, because when you're a kid, all you do is play football on the nearest patch of grass. But when you get to be a teenager and you're starting to understand that the world's a bigger place and you want things to do and there's nothing to do, then it kind of starts hitting you, you know. We started by 2 bands coming together. Mine, Frank and Darren's old band, Soul Cellar, and Tony and John, the 2 brothers, and their friend Gordon, who played in a band called Box. And the 2 bands came together when I think we'd booked a gig, put on a local gig in a place called the Willow Room in Corby, which was Soul Cellar and Box, amongst others, who were like the young up-and-coming band at the time. They were like 2 years younger than us, but they were like kids in our eyes. And then after that gig, yeah, we ended up in a huge drunken fight amongst the members of Soul Cellar, which I can't really go into too much detail, but it was a pretty poisonous situation, and it was quite clear that that band was done. Me and Frank had 2 or 3 bands together at that point, and yeah, it didn't take long until we decided that we'd continue to do something else. And I don't remember whose idea it was, but to get the 3 guys from Box and put those 2 bands together, because we kind of liked what they were doing, so it came together that way. The idea of the music we wanted to play with Speedon came from when Soul Cellar had a gig in London at some all-day thing, and there was a lot of kind of, you know, metal bands playing. I remember like My Dying Bride, and I think maybe Cathedral, I don't know, but there was a lot of more sort of technical death metal bands. And then we were first on the bill, and nervous and not knowing what the fuck we were doing there, but probably trying to sound a bit more like those other bands that were playing. And then we'd seen these other guys walking around in the crowd during the day. They kind of turned up during the 3rd band or something, and they didn't look like they belonged there. They looked like something else. They were like, most of them had like shorter hair, skinheads, trucker caps, backpacks, and were sort of walking, mingling through the crowd, looking like they were about to knock someone out or something. They just looked like pissed off, and I was thinking, who the fuck are these guys, you know? And then the next thing, they like line checking on stage, and they're in a band. Still looking like they didn't want to be there, looking like they'd rather be somewhere else. And then they started playing, and it was like the heaviest thing I've ever had in my life. Yeah, and it wasn't technical, it wasn't metal like that. It was really loose, pretty sloppy, really sort of down-tuned, kind of Black Sabbath-y riffs, but tuned to God knows what. And then the singer Johnny, who looked like some skinhead skater guy, just started screaming the most visceral thing I've ever had in my life. Right there and then I knew that if we're going to do another band, then it's going to sound like this, And it wasn't just the music, it was the attitude and everything, They were fierce, and they looked genuinely pissed off, and that's kind of how I was feeling at the time as well. And then when Speed On started going, I remember sitting with Gordon, the drummer, one day, and we were kind of dreaming about where this band was going to go, and we didn't really have any big dreams about getting a label or touring the world. Like the height of our ambition was to get a gig with Iron Monkey, which I think maybe the third or fourth show we played with Iron Monkey, and it was like, well, maybe that was that then. The band's good, it's done. I think the first name of the band had was like Dose, which I don't really remember where it came. It must have been some song title from some band or something. That's where most of the names come from in those days. But I was actually at Reading Festival. I don't remember it must have been 98, I guess. And I was there with a bunch of friends from Corby, and a friend of mine, Roddy, was there. And we ended up hanging out with him and a bunch of his friends, because he was like, he'd moved to Nottingham. He was like, he'd left Corby. He had like moved to the big city, which was like a big thing for us. He was there with this friend of his called Dave, who I kind of felt an attachment to immediately. He was like this really kind of charming guy and a great storyteller, and it's kind of like, sat, drank around this campfire at a music festival with Dave, just spinning stories. And he told this story about someone, I can't remember who it was, someone he knew who had taken a lot of speed one night and came home to his girlfriend at the time and was really horny as speed could make you, and kind of described it as, like having like a hard on that wouldn't go down and couldn't be tempered, and wasn't really at the same time getting anywhere with, and just described it as like having a raging speed on, which I, like, being in my drunken state, found absolutely hilarious. And that was the name of it, like a amphetamine induced hard on, which doesn't really lead anywhere. And I think he told the story of just him like beating off all night and not really getting anywhere at all, and his girlfriend had like given up long before and just gone to bed and slept. And it came around, I remember this clearly, that I was laughing, saying that's the name of our band, kind of thing. And Dave, who was kind of just breaking into working in the music industry, living down in London, kind of joked, well, if you call the band that, I'll manage you guys. A few months later, I got in touch with Roddy and said, we're calling the name of the band that, let Dave know. Dave stuck to his promise and came down to hear us play at a rehearsal in Corby and fell in love with it immediately. The first gig was in Corby, in the back room of this pub called Rockingham Arms, which it was known as The Rock. Had nothing to do with rock music and anything like that. It was just a short name for the Rockingham Arms. But this was a pub. It was around the corner from my parents' house, and my grandparents had worked there in the bar. My granddad was supposed to be working there, but he was normally on the other side of the bar drinking, and my grandma was serving drinks. But they had this kind of back room, like a function room, which you could rent. When we'd started Speed On, that just popped up. Like, yeah, I think you can rent that room pretty cheap, and so we did that. I can't remember the other bands that were playing, but one of the support bands I remember was just about to go on and start their gig, and the entire room just emptied. Everybody ran outside, and there was a fucking car on fire in the car park. So they were like stood there waiting to play, or started playing, and like all of a sudden the room was just emptied out, and everyone's like looking at this burning car. And we played, and I remember, like, we had this idea that we didn't really want anyone to like us from Corby, because we felt like, that we had this love-hate relationship with the town, because all the alternative kids in those days were like listening to Korn or Deftones and things like that, and which was not anywhere we were coming from whatsoever. And so yeah, we were probably already by that point thinking we were better than that and, you know, above all that shit. I remember thinking that, you know, I also wanted to like everyone to run away from our gig because they didn't understand it, but the Burning Car had already done that with the band before, so they'd kind of beaten us to it. But I think we played like 4 songs maybe, and the set was like an hour, because when we started out it was all super slow, super really long songs and just sludgy mess. And pretty sure we did like a version of High Hole which lasted about 20 minutes or something, and it was, you know, we were rolling around on the floor just making feedback and noise. And then there were people like looking at us like thinking, what the fuck is this, you know? And I felt like then we'd like achieved what we'd set out to do anyway, which was to confuse people. If we weren't fighting other people, then we were fighting amongst ourselves a lot of the time. And it sounds kind of cliche to say that was like kind of created the chemistry in the band, but it kind of did. Some of us did kind of have rough backgrounds, you know, and it was kind of natural to some of them to... There wasn't much discussing, it was a lot of fighting, you know. There was like full-blown fist fights now and again, you know, amongst the band. But then as soon as we were in a situation where we felt like we were being attacked, then there was that feeling of unity. Then we all came together kind of thing, you know. That happened more than a few times during touring. I was like the older guy in the band. I was like the dad in the band. That I think I was maybe 1 or 2 years older than Frank, who was below me kind of thing. So I was like I guess you could say the sensible one, but I was always the one in the middle trying to keep the peace amongst everyone. I remember I think it was maybe it was the second. We played the Rock a couple of times, and I think the second time Tony and Darren had been like arguing about something before, and there was a bit of bad vibes going into the gig. And then at one point Tony's like down on his knees like sorting his lead to his pedal or something out, and Darren just like took his bass like headstock and just rammed it into his head and into his temple. And I remember thinking, fuck me, what was that all about? And Tony almost fell over, and that turned into like a big ruckus kind of thing. And I asked Darren after, like, what the fuck did you do that for? He's like, he was just there. And it was like, you know, he'd pissed me off earlier. I was like, fuck me. And that was kind of like, yes, pretty symptomatic of how the band, you know. But on the other side of that, all that kind of also paved the way that we always had this very sort of kind of flat hierarchy. There was no hierarchy in the band. It was like there was nobody that was like bigger than the band, and if one person stormed off after a fight, then we would just carry on without them kind of thing. And so there was no, so that kind of also like kind of got rid of any sort of rock star tendencies in the band. There was no room for that, you know. I remember John storming out of practice one time in the beginning, and we just continued practicing for like 2 hours, and when we came out he was just sat on a wall outside like looking sad. It's like, I think he was a bit sad that we just nobody had chased him to say, hey man, come back to practice. We just carried on. When Dave Bianchi, my really good friend, became our manager, he'd actually just started working for this like label down in London, which was like some sort of R&B label or something called Green Island, and he'd like been given sort of permission off this label owner he had. The Green Island was run by this like Rastafari Jamaican guy who was like didn't know who he was. He felt a bit shady but also charming, and he'd give Dave free rein to like start this little subsidiary called Black Island that was going to do more alternative, heavier stuff, because that was Dave's background as well. So when they took us on, the idea was not to like, you know, try and sign us up to a big record label and do all that commercial stuff. They understood pretty quick we weren't a commercial band. And Dave's idea was to just put us out on some sort of guerrilla marketing campaign, which basically meant just going out and touring, playing every night of the week. And there was not much support money-wise, but it was still, you know, luxurious in the sense that they give us money to pay for a van, and a van meant like, you know, renting like a transit van with no windows in the back, and we'd be sat in the back on amplifiers and rolling around as we drove like 8 hours to Glasgow or whatever. But they gave us money to rent the cheapest van we could find, and a bit of money for petrol every day. And the rest we had to work out ourselves. Where we would sleep, we had to work out ourselves. Where we'd get food from, we had to work out ourselves, because no venue was booking us and giving us food or drink or anything in those days. Nobody had ever heard of us. But the idea was just to go round and round and round the UK. And we used to call it the toilet circuit. It was like all these dive places, you know. And we played to like anywhere between 5 and 30 people a night. Most, you know, I would say the average crowd was about 10 people a night. But the idea was just go out and just play as hard as you can. And, you know, you're going to play this place like the Axe and Cleaver pub in wherever it was, you know, Boston or something. There's going to be 10 people there, but you're going to blow their minds. And then when you come back 2 months later, there's going to be 30 people there because they've told their friends. And then there's going to be 100 people there. And it did work, you know, like, and we kind of, we got really tight live by playing constantly. And we probably played, I would say we averaged maybe 150 to 200 shows a year the first few years, and just going round and round the UK and watching it build up gradually, kind of thing. It toughens you up playing to like no one night after night and having nowhere to sleep. You know, we would sleep in the back of the van. Some point someone got the great idea of like, well, let's buy some tents and sleep in tents, because then all we have to do is just drive out of town, get to the nearest country lane and sleep in a tent. And we were doing that in like, you know, outside Newcastle in January, and it was fucking freezing. I remember like one night going to sleep in this tent, and we were rowing about something, arguing, and like, you know, almost going to sleep after almost coming to like fist fight, and then waking up shivering in the middle of the night, and all the fighting was forgotten, and we were just like hugging each other, shivering, God, like, hold me. And food, we would just steal from, you know, like service stations. Or Roddy, our friend who was driving, it's like, you know, if you turn up at like a service station at midnight, you know, all the restaurants empty their food they don't have, they just put it in the bins. So then we were like climbing around in the garbage bins and just getting food out of there and eating from there. And any money we did have, if we scraped together any money by selling a demo tape or anything like that, then obviously that we'd buy booze with that, because the number one priority was always to get drunk, and that food we could steal, you know. So yeah, as we're like just circuiting around the UK, round after round after round, and playing, you know, 4 or 5 nights a week, and then we were doing like little tour after tour. Tours were just like, you know, going back to back basically. We'd recorded like a demo tape. There was like a little studio in Corby who we were pretty friendly with. The guy who ran that, this old guy called Ian, who'd played in this like band called Energy in the 70s, like some rock band. It was a pretty decent price, and we'd recorded the first demo tape, which we thought, well, that's a way of, you know, getting a bit of money when we got on play shows, sell a cassette tape. As we were coming back to these places, and it had gone from like, you know, playing to 10 people to 30 to 40, then we were starting to sell these tapes as well, and they were starting to sell pretty well. So then we did like a second tape, because when we were not out playing, then we were home rehearsing and writing songs, and so we'd written 2 demo tapes worth of songs, like I think there was 4 songs on each maybe, and they were starting to sell. And I think we sold pretty much all in all those 2 tapes, maybe like 1,000 copies or something over the space of a year or so. And I think that's when I really started to notice that there's a bit of interest in this band. You know, we did that Iron Monkey support slot after 4 shows, and something else is happening now. It's starting to pick up maybe. You know, as like I say, we had contact with Dave and this Black Island label. Eventually Dave started talking to us about, you guys are going to have to do a record, you know. And our first reaction was, well, why? We've got 2 tapes, we can just keep selling them. And he's like, no guys, it's like, you know, things are starting to happen, but we can't just keep sending you around the UK without, you know, there is a point to all this, you know. At some point we're going to have to do a record. And I think it put me off immediately, because someone had sold it as like, you guys need a product, and I hated the fucking idea of having a product. Our idea of the band was just touring and playing live, and, you know. But Dave made the pretty good point of, you know, well, if you guys love touring so much and want to carry on touring, at some point you're going to have a record to tour with, because, you know, you can't just tour these 2 demo tapes for the rest of your career. I was like, all right, fair enough, I guess. So we kind of went unwillingly into a studio. That wasn't our idea of fun, going into a studio and recording. It was like, okay, we'll go into the studio for a week and then we can go back and carry on playing gigs. And so yeah, it was like a little bit against our will doing the first record kind of thing. And that record, the 9 or 10 songs on it, we'd written over the course of the couple of years before and been playing them live for 2 years. And by the time we'd recorded that first record, we'd probably played all the songs maybe 250 times or something. So in my mind, it was just a case of just going into a studio which has a bit better recording equipment and a bit more professional or whatever, and just banging them out over 2 days, the songs, and then getting back out there and carrying on. We wrote as a band. We were like, despite all the chaos and fighting and stuff, we were a pretty solid unit when it came to writing the songs. And as much as we didn't really take particularly anything seriously outside of everything around the band, we did kind of take seriously writing the music. The music was always serious to us. It would always like start with like one of us coming up with a riff and then writing it together. But I wrote quite a lot of the riffs, and Tony wrote a fair share as well. Strangely enough, like Frank, who was by far the most musically talented out of all of us, and Darren, the bass player, come from a bit of a musical family as well. But Frank, I don't think wrote any riffs on the first. He just kind of screamed on it. But I'd played in bands with Frank before, and he'd drum, and he was the best drummer I knew in town. He was the best guitarist, and he was really good. And me and Tony weren't particularly good guitar players, but our guitar style suited Speedhorn on what we wanted to do with it, kind of thing. So I would say like most of the stuff came from me and Tony, and Darren wrote Darren didn't write that much, but when he did, it was about he wrote like the last riff in Knives and Faces, which was one of my favorite riffs on the record. I think Darren even wrote the main riff, the thumper, as well, and then me and Tony wrote pretty much the rest. And lyrics was also like a bit of an afterthought in the band. It was like, because when we were writing, then John and Frank would just scream without any lyrics, because the idea was that the lyrics would be kind of undecipherable anyway. So they would kind of just scream like vocal patterns. They'd know where they were screaming, at least most of the time anyway. I remember when we were in the studio and they were screaming, doing their vocals, then they would, with a bunch of the songs, they were sat there afterwards listening back, like saying, okay, what does that sound like? And they were like writing lyrics from what it sounded like, from what they could make out of these screams, kind of thing. It was recorded in Albert Studios in London. I don't remember how many days we were in there, but it didn't feel like a particularly long time, because like I said, we were in a rush to just get it over and done with and get back out playing, really. So we had no interest of being there like for a couple of weeks. I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 days max or something. And what I remember about it really was that none of us were particularly asked about where it was. It's like the label had the suggestion, and it was like, yeah, whatever kind of thing. We just want to get this done with. Dave, our manager, said to us, well, this studio is like owned by the AC/DC guys. I'm like, what? It was like they like the Young Brothers, I think it was something to do with their publishing company or something like that, owned the studio. So that felt like, oh, that's pretty cool. But then it also made me realize like this is probably quite expensive as well, and we never had any idea about what things were costing then. So when they put us in there, I realized, okay, well, there obviously is some sort of money involved. I think the rest of us wanted to record with this guy, Andy Sneap in Nottingham, who had recorded the Iron Monkey albums, and of course we wanted to record with him. And maybe that was the first sort of telltale sounds that our label were thinking, yeah, Iron Monkey, and all that's great and stuff, but that's not going to sell a lot of records. And they were wanting to maybe push us in a bit of a different direction, and it was never going to be commercial, but I think they seen something that it would sell more records than what bands like Iron Monkey were doing in the underground scene. That also scared me a little bit because that's not where I wanted to go. My vision of the band was to be like, you know, a kind of cultish underground band on the level of like Iron Monkey and I Hate God and Electric Wizard and bands like that. That's what I wanted to sound like. I guess the label had other ideas. So it was a no to Andy Sneap, which pissed me off, I remember, and then kind of just going with whoever. And we ended up recording with this guy called John Fryer, who was a nice enough guy and stuff, you know, kind of mild, easygoing guy. But I remember the label selling us that on that, you know, oh, he's recorded with Nine Inch Nails and things like this. And I was like, what the fuck has Nine Inch Nails got to do with Raging Speedo? And I hated that band. You know? And so I was terrified of sounding like that. But like I said, he was a nice guy. And we went into the studio and I don't remember much except it was this really fucking big live room. It felt huge. And but then they set me and Tony in this little kind of guitar amp booth between like the control room and the main live room. And I remember the two of us like had the idea of just recording all our guitars at the same time, so we played together in this little room and just bounced off each other. And I just remember that little room being full of smoke. It's like, I remember even thinking then, like, the AC/DC guys can't be too happy with us smoking this. In their studio, we could barely see each other through the fog. I think it was my idea, but I don't think it was like a big thing that anyone's against to have the first album as being self-titled. It was like so many bands I loved had like Black Sabbath and once again Iron Monkey and others. I probably had already ideas then about what the next album would be called, but the first one was going to be called that. As much as I cared about what the music sounded like, and what we all cared about what the music sounded like, the artwork I don't think anybody was particularly bothered about. I'm sure we had some ideas, but the label who was going to put it out were quite firm that the first album had to have like a picture of the band on it, which I didn't really like the idea of, but wasn't prepared to fight enough to challenge that. It wasn't something I cared particularly enough to put my energy into fighting against, so it's like, yeah, whatever. And then I think when they said about, you know, that it could at least be some sort of action shot from a live setting, then that felt better than just all of us being stood up against the wall and being dressed up and whatever kind of thing. So yeah, that was definitely something the label had, and I think it actually came from a still from the Thumper video, I think, which was also something I and the rest of the band didn't really give a piss about either. Videos and stuff, that was everything, all that stuff was just like, it's just taking time from us being out and playing live kind of thing. The whole like art side and aesthetic side of things was, you know, something we began to care more about as the band went on and the older you get and you want more artistic control and stuff. I'm pretty like ambivalent towards it. It doesn't really, you know, I don't particularly have any. I'm quite neutral to it really. It's like, you know, it's nothing I think, oh wow, it's like some kind of iconic art record cover. It's certainly not that. Almost how I feel a little bit towards the album in general, really. I mean, I know we're discussing like 25 years of the album and stuff, but there was a bit of ambivalence around everything around it. We just wanted to get it out and carry on kind of thing. The record was released in August 2000, I guess. And we had a release party for it at the Garage in Highbury, London Garage, which is like a classic sort of smaller venue. I'd seen a bunch of favourite bands there before, and so that felt like a nice idea. I can't remember if we played it. I think we maybe did. And then we had like a big party in the bar, which was next to the venue room. We had like a bunch of friends come down, and it was a free bar, and that was like, you know, carnage. Obviously everyone got properly wasted afterwards because it was an endless bar. That was the first time I remember thinking, this is starting to feel like we're becoming part of the industry, where I had like a release party, you know, and there's industry types here, and we were just at the bar getting fucked and not really caring about it, you know. All we cared about was the free beer. That whole free beer thing never got old. Obviously, when we get told we have to go into the studio and we have to record a record, then the next thing you're expecting is the label say, yeah, and you have to do a video as well, which was something else we weren't particularly enthused about very much. It was just like, oh, And I learned pretty quick that doing a video is a long day's work. As far as not particularly having much input ourselves into what the video was going to be, we did meet the people recording the video. And I can say that the guy who was like directing it, this guy called Matt Wakeham, we got on with him like really well from the kickoff. It felt like he understood us, and he was coming from a sort of similar background. We had trust issues with our band, but him I felt like we could, trust. And so we kind of let him come up with an idea, which was the whole, empty skyscraper and a skateboard guy and stuff. And that felt, that was cool to us. And I really like Matt. I think Matt also, if not then, not long after at least, was involved in the whole Gorillaz thing with Damon Albarn. He was one of those people. That was like a fun detail, I thought. But it was a long, long day. I remember thinking naively we'd go in and it would take like 3 or 4 hours and then we could just go home to Corby. But it took like almost 24 hours, I think. It was a nightmare. I mean, like I said, I don't think any of us were particularly enthused, but I was probably among the more kind of vocal opponents of it. By this point, we knew what we were getting ourselves into and knew that this was just part and parcel of it kind of thing. And yeah, probably there were others in the band that were a bit more enthusiastic than I was, but I was one of the people in the band that was probably a bit more negative to everything to do with the record label, because negative about it. I mean, to be honest, it scared me. It made me. Felt really uncomfortable with the whole thing. It probably turned out better than I thought it would. What I liked about it is that we kept it kind of like close to home. Like, I had a lot of friends in the video, like Roddy, who drove us a lot in those days, who'd been a vital part of the band in the early days. I think like Dave's wife was in it, and friends from Corby. Some of my best friends were in the crowd and stuff. And also one of my best friends today and one of my early idols in the music scene, Bloody Kev, who sang in Hard to Swallow. That band were a big part of the reason that we went with 2 singers in Raging Speedhorn, because Hard to Swallow had 2 singers and they were a major influence as well. It's one of those things, I think, when it pops up now and again. I've seen it a while ago and you just kind of laugh to yourself. I mean, I have a tendency to think that every video we ever did was kind of cheesy and stuff, and I have a hard time seeing myself on camera anyway, and but yeah, I mean, it's acceptable enough. It's far from the worst video we ever did anyway, I think. Yeah, that was a thing. Another typical thing where, this is starting to us clash with label on ideas and stuff. And we really wanted to release a record on vinyl, of course. I mean, we were all we all came from that background of, my dad had loads of vinyl at home, Frank's dad did, Darren's dad, we all did, So for us, if music was going to be released, it's supposed to be released on vinyl. But this was at a time when CD was really taking off. And so it was somewhat disappointing to me that the label, they kind of got on board with the releasing it, but I wanted to say, well, if we're going to release the vinyl, it should be with the original cover. But they had an idea of making limited edition with just this white cover, which we would sign. So I remember we were sat at some office in London and just signing God knows how many vinyl and writing. And then the more and more bored we were getting, the more and more stupid messages we were writing on some of them. I thought it was pretty cool that it was coloured vinyl, but I wish we'd kind of had the original cover, even if I wasn't asked about how the cover looked. I thought we should at least have the actual artwork on the vinyl, but yeah. And that was another battle that I couldn't be bothered fighting over, just let it go. I remember feeling surprised, going out to play shows after it and people coming up to me and saying they really liked it, and we were like, oh really? Because I think it sounds like shit. I mean, the reception for the record was beyond our expectations, I guess. It was probably got better reviews than we would have reviewed it ourselves. Because I remember thinking quite immediately, well, yeah, it wasn't really what I was envisioning as the sound, because I'd wanted it to sound like this other thing, and the whole, I wanted it to sound like I Hate God, Iron Monkey, that sludgy stuff, and it maybe didn't quite become that. It was a bit more, in my eyes, polished than what I'd wanted it to sound like, which sounds funny when you listen to it now. It's not particularly polished, but I think that was just a lot to do with the fact that, you know, like we felt like we maybe hadn't had complete control over it and hadn't actually taken the reins and taken control over it either. But it got really good reviews, I think, and I don't know if it was the record or a live thing, but one of my favourite quotes at the time was someone had labelled as like Dole Q Hatecore, which is, you know, like, which is pretty accurate description of us, I think. Yeah, that was probably the absolute most horrifying thing any of us could, you know. That was like the last thing I wanted to hear. It being people writing, calling it new metal, I mean, that was anathema to us, you know. But I mean, I guess that was part of the fact that we would like say yes to playing with anyone because we just wanted to play. So, you know, as long as we could go out and play, we didn't give a fuck who it was with, you know. And new metal was a thing that was happening then. It was getting big, and of course it was easy for people to put us in that pigeonhole, and also it was an obvious thing for labels and bookers to want to put us on tour with and play with, you know. Our take on playing with those bands was like, well, those bands and that music has nothing to do with us, but it's easy. It makes it easy for us to go on, share a stage with some of these bands and just blow them away, because we would sound so heavy compared to them, kind of thing. So it was like, for us, it was like an easy win in that way. But it did contribute to us getting put into that pigeonhole, which, you know, was horrifying to us to be labelled that. We went on like a massive 7-week European tour with Biohazard. We went out in September, and it was supposed to be 7 weeks. We ended up coming home a few days before Christmas, because the Biohazard tour, which was our first trip out into like mainland Europe, and it was amazing. That whole tour felt like a celebration of the first album coming out, and it was amazing shows every night. You know, at least 800-900 people. Great for us. And then midway through that tour, we got a call saying, you've been offered another tour, which starts 3 days after this one. You're going to go back to Corby a day or two and straight back out again, 5 more weeks, with a band called Amen from the States. Had no idea who they were. We were like, yeah, cool. And then ended up going straight to Ireland after that and doing some headline shows. And I remember like being beaten down and lying in bed in the tour bus with the flu just before about to go on stage and play. And yeah, it was fucked. We'd been doing a lot of drinking primarily, and coming home to Corby and my mum bursting into tears because I was like decimated, and she's like, what happened to you? We were nominated, I think, for like Best Newcomer or something like that at the Kerrang Awards. I mean, I realise now that I sound like a crabby old man by the time I was 20, but that was also something that I've never really understood. You know, I've never understood the concept of awards and prizes for playing music, because music is completely subjective. You know, it's like any art form, and you can only make something and create something that you want to hear yourself. You know, we tried to make a record that we'd want to hear ourselves. I'd want to have on my own record shelf. You know, but then to have that like be put into some sort of competition. I've never understood the concept of music as competition. But as usual, it was like, you know, they said we'd be nominated as Best Newcomer, blah, blah, blah. Didn't give a fuck about that. But there was a free bar, and free bar normally meant that we'd turn up. So we went along, didn't win it, of course, because we weren't that trendy. You know, there was other trendy bands at the time. So it was just a big piss up, basically. And yeah. And now I think it was actually the first award they announced as well, and we didn't win. I was like, right, let's just get on with getting pissed, which we did. So, and yeah, some things went down, I think, at that award show, which is still now like what it was 25 years later or something. What it was, it's one of those things that did that actually happen, but I remember being extremely drunk. They put a load of bottles of heavy booze on our table, and we drunk up most of it. And the label had kind of managed to get us to sit in one place at the table until the first award was announced, which is the award we were being announced on. And then when they'd let that go, then they couldn't contain us anymore. let us loose, and we drank up all our booze, and then we just went wandering around like the big hall it was in and just finding any other booze and drinking that as well. And I remember in like a drunken haze being at someone else's table and trying to like take some beer or a bottle or something, and looking up at Frank, who was like amongst some other table, and he'd grabbed this bottle and was looking at me and laughing. And then in all this haze, they were bringing up the Swedish actress Britt Ekland to come and announce this next award, and she was kind of walking through the snaking between the tables behind Frank, and Frank just threw this empty bottle over his shoulder, and it landed right in front of her, and she like slipped on it. And then there was this huge thing, and there's this swarm around her, and I think I remember trying to like help her up, and she was like extremely annoyed, obviously, and in a lot of pain, I think. And I mean, whether this is true or not, I don't even remember because it's so hazy now. But I have this foggy memory of trying to tell her she was my favourite Bond girl, and her telling me to fuck off. And then Frank just saying, "Oh, fuck her, Gaz, the miserable bastard," and he just went away. I remember us all waking up the next day, extremely, extremely hungover, sat drinking coffee with Dave at our label. And Dave, our manager, saying, as much as I want to make a story out of this, we can't afford to get sued right now. And I think someone in Cradle of Filth had claimed it was them that had done it. We were like, but it was us, it was fucking Frank. And Dave saying, I know, but this is just one we're going to have to let go, because we could get sued so much that it would fucking finish the band. Let them have it. And we're like, yeah, fuck it, we don't care anyway. They need an angle, they need an image, and they start portraying us as this kind of bunch of hoodlums from this town, and that was a rough place. And there was no doubt that the town, Corby, we were from, was a rough place, you know, it was. And we were certainly a product of that. But I mean, at the same time, we all had like really supporting families, and I had a great relationship with my parents, and I'd had a happy upbringing. But your upbringing can only bring you so far. When you get to 14, 15 years old and you realise you're in this dead-end town and there's nothing going on and you want to do other things, and there is a lot of violence there, you know, you would get beat up just randomly. If I was walking down the street on my own, there was a bunch of kids coming the other way, I would cross the street, you know, and that's just survival mode, because you would get beat up for having like long hair or catching eye contact with someone, and you know, there was any excuse for, you know, to get jumped, and people would get jumped all the time, you know, by 4 or 5 other kids. So that was definitely a part of where we come from. And like I said before, I mean, there was a lot of that within our band as well, you know, we fought amongst ourselves, but it was of course something that the press wanted to run with as well and make an image of us, which it was hyperbole and it was blown up, but not without grains of truth in it. That's definitely where we were coming from, you know. We knew we're in the game now and becoming, like it or not, part of this whole industry thing, you know. They'd released a record, they were putting us out on tour, and don't get me wrong, going out on tour and starting to tour Europe, starting to go to places like Japan, you know, then you have to accept that it's not for free, you know. There's certain things you have to do, and doing press is one of those things. And it was like with everything else, you know, it's like every time we had to go down to London and do some photo shoot or do some interviews, it was like always met with a sigh and some moaning and some complaints, but we did it. Yeah, what can I say? That was like that whole like being on the cover with Lost Prophets, and then Frank did a cover with a fucking gun and stuff, and it's like, you're just young, and you know, you just like, you get told you're getting a cover of a magazine, this is a big thing, and we're like kind of ambivalent to it, but yeah, you know, it's like that was our idea, like at least giving something back to the label. Okay, we can't say no to like being on the cover of a magazine, of course not, and we probably wanted to be as well, to be honest. We were starting to get into the whole thing of it was around that time that I started realizing like this actually could be going somewhere, you know. This could be some sort of career, or at least something that we do full time for a while anyway. I was never in the illusion that this is going to make us rich. That was never the goal, but it did start hitting home that this actually could be something I'd do for the rest of my life anyway, and be in a band, which was never the, and that was all. If you wanted to, if that was starting to become a reality, then the reality also was that you're gonna have to do things like this. And I think John was a little bit disappointed that he was getting to be on a cover and then he had to share it with someone else. And then the fact it was like lost profits and that, I mean, obviously things took a lot darker turn with that guy many years after. But yeah, that was about as close contact as we ever had with him, kind of thing. To be honest, the one label we always really got on well with was the Japanese guys, because the Japanese guys are just so friendly and so sweet. And that was like the biggest label of all of them. There was like Epic Records, it was a massive label, but they were so nice to people and like down to earth and really cool people. So for them, we would have done anything. It was like, I mean, fuck, they brought us to Japan. It's like we were eternally grateful. I still am eternally grateful for those guys for taking us over there. One occasion we were there playing this festival, and it's like Guitar Magazine wants to do like a cover with all these people from bands that play in this festival, and it was like Slayer and maybe Pantera and someone else, and it was like very American people, and American metal people are very serious about certain things, and me and Tony were there not very serious whatsoever. And I remember that like the whole photo shoot, me and Tony were just like stood like laughing and giggling and probably a little bit drunk. And the fact is, well, they'd give us these ridiculous guitars, like these pointy, metal-y, spiky guitars, and we were just like totally taking the piss and not taking it seriously. And yeah, ended up on some sort of cover with Kerry King and some others, and we felt totally out of place as usual, which we were. Kind of says a lot about how, like, how little of a clue really we had about industry things, and also who people were. We're there in Japan. Unbeknown to us, they'd booked this photographer guy who was a big deal. He was like Iron Maiden's photographer and Metallica's photographer. He's like, the label said, this guy's like on a retainer. He gets paid a wage by Metallica. He's their go-to guy. And we're like, all right. And then they booked us this like photo shoot with him. And of course, we were out the night before. I remember at one point in the night, I think we were in Tokyo, and saying, all right, guys, it's like 2:00. We really should go back to the hotel soon. I think we have this photo shoot at like 9:00 in the morning or something. And then ending up in a back street in some gay nightclub in Tokyo at 5:00 in the morning, off our fucking heads, and then getting back to the hotel at like 6:00 in the morning and going to bed thinking, how's this gonna work? And having to knock Frank up out of his room, who just wanted to cancel, refused to come downstairs, and then finally pulling him out of bed after like an hour's sleep. He's still out of his mind, and coming downstairs to meet our extremely unimpressed Ross Halfin, and he was hard as nails and didn't take any shit from any of us, and spent the entire day calling Frank Francesca. I remember Frank wearing these ridiculous like Terminator sunglasses because his eyes look like piss holes in the snow. I remember we were heading off to the first location and get onto the subway, and the first thing Frank did was like bang his head on the subway door and nearly knocking himself out. And it's like, oh god, this is going to be a long hard day. Ross was not amused in the slightest. I mean, I remember feeling pretty rich because we were getting, at some point, we never had any idea what our finances were doing. We were just constantly going out on the road, and of course I understood that things like vans and petrol and touring cost money, but we were never seeing any of it in that sense. But at some point, for some period at least, there was enough money in our kind of band bank account to pay ourselves like a minimum wage to do the band. And I think I was getting something like 600 quid a month or something like that. 800 quid, which was probably what would have been earning if we was continuing to work on the job agencies around Corby, working in factories. Is probably about what we were getting paid from working there. That's amazing to me, getting paid the same as I'd get paid working in a factory, but getting to do music instead, And then, of course, when you're on tour all the time, you don't really spend any money anyway. By that time, we were at least getting free food and free drink and getting to sleep somewhere. As much as I didn't like the idea of the band being treated like a job, I mean, for a couple of years at least, we were getting at least a minimum wage, but we never made any money in the long run out of it. And we were like so stupid that I remember at one point the money was getting low, and then our manager said to us, well, you know, there's this merch company who wants to pay for the rights for your merch. And we were like, well, didn't sound like the greatest idea, but then they told us it was going to be like, I don't know, £20,000 or something like that. And we went, fuck, all right, well, I guess so then. So then we sold off on that pretty much immediately. And then, of course, 15% goes to the management, so it's down to whatever it is, 15,000, and then there's 6 of us in the band, and it ended up being like £2,000 each or something like that. And I had like credit card bills of £1,500 or something, because you're young and stupid and got a credit card. So it amounted to pretty much nothing. And then the merch, people are sending this guy on tour with us all of a sudden to sell our shirts. I'm like, all right. Didn't really make any sort of greater contact with him, except his name was Steve, and our tour manager called him Steve the Sleeve, which we thought was hilarious, and called him that the whole time. But I think he barely got to travel with us. We got to the end of the first couple of tours and hadn't really realised that we'd signed our merch off for like 5 years. We thought it was like for a tour or two. And our manager to that was flabbergasted, and so we ended up just like bootlegging our own shirts. We'd got to the point where we headlined the Astoria, which was probably like the peak of our career. You know, it was like almost 3,000 people, and we'd gone from playing to 10 people a night to, in the space of 3 years, playing to 3,000, at least in London. That night we were headlining that show, we were bootlegging our own shirts, and Frank was encouraging everyone in the crowd to like not buy shirts from the lobby in the venue, but to meet us out the back. And we were like literally selling shirts out the back of a van at the back of this gig, not really paying or caring too much about the fact we could have been sued to fucking high heaven for that. But yeah, highlights were, of course, I mean, going to Europe for the first time. When we started touring around the UK, that was like a bit of an escape from Corby, obviously, because when I was like 16, 17, the only thing I cared about was trying to get out of Corby. You know, you start going on to London and seeing gigs down there, and it makes you realise that there's so much more to offer. And then when we started touring Europe, you know, that made me start. That makes you realise that the world, there's so much more to see, you know, and really kind of broadens your perspective on so many different things, you know, travel and places, cultures, music, and everything. So touring Europe for the first time was incredible, you know, and the Biohazard tour is probably still to this day one of the best tours I've ever done. And Japan was absolutely amazing. That was something I never dreamed of doing, you know, going to Japan and playing music. You know, we'd come a long way from the dreams of that first gig supporting Iron Monkey to suddenly playing in Japan, you know, having people follow us back to our hotel and giving us presents, you know, and like, yeah, amazing. Obviously, the touring continued, and then it continued at an even greater pace probably after the first record came out. We just toured continuously, and then next thing you know, you're getting called down to like a meeting with a label in January at the start of the next year. Okay, they just give us a piece of paper with a load of dates on. This is how the next year looks. And then the same the next year after that. It's just touring, which was obviously what we wanted to do, but with the amount we were drinking and partying and not taking care of ourselves and touring endlessly, that starts. And we were like, had a quite destructive relationship anyway. Of course, that starts tearing at relationships in the band after a while. And then I remember when we were going to do the second record, like the label had just told us, okay, you got 2 weeks block here to write the next record. And that just like blew my mind. And then it hit me like, it's like a fucking job. My idea was never this was going to be a job, you know, like we got worn down and relationships started getting, I mean, they were never the strongest anyway, but they started getting really frayed with the more and more touring we were doing. So I think the first to go was Tony. That was, you know, it could have been any of us really. It happened to be him, but yeah, we were not in a good place after 4 or 5 years of constant touring kind of thing. We're burnt out, basically, you know. And we were never the best equipped to deal with that anyway, so. Pretty hard to believe it's been 25 years. It's pretty hard to believe that I'm 25 years older than I was when we released that. It's amazing to me sometimes, you know, when people get in touch still to this day and say it was a big influence for them, and which seems crazy because it was, in my eyes, pretty basic music. And, you know, for me it was like the start of things, you know. When we got the chance to do that record, then I got the chance to do music on a full-time basis, which I did for quite a few years after that. When you'd asked me about doing this thing, then it obviously put me in the mood and frame of mind to go back and listen to the record. And it's not something I do particularly often. It's not something I do particularly often with any of the albums I've released, with any of the bands I played with, because my head is so most of the time my head is so intensely engaged in making an album and that whole process that I listen to an album intensely while we're making it, and then by the time it's kind of done, I'm exhausted by it, and you're done with it, and you're already thinking about the next record kind of thing. And we had like a strange relationship with this album afterwards. We were a lot happy with the sound on the second record, I remember. I always remember feeling a little bit disappointed with how the sound on this record came out, and maybe disappointed that we hadn't really taken enough control of it ourselves either, or kind of really fought for getting it to sound like we wanted it to. My favourite versions of those songs are probably the demo tapes we did, which is probably like a cliche thing to say. A lot of bands say that, but probably, you know. I loved the songs, but was never really particularly overwhelmed by how the record looked or how it sounded either, really. And it was maybe a couple of songs had been, well, the final versions were quicker than we'd envisioned, you know. But then again, my original vision of our first album was probably like a 4-song, 1-hour sludge fest, and it wasn't quite that, you know. And then surprisingly, when I go and listen to it now, I listened to it like a couple of weeks ago, and like with everything else, it's not as bad as I thought. It's actually, you know, it has its time, it has its place, and it was very much of its era and represents something that we were then. And so now I have like more of an appreciation for it, I think, and it was pretty raw, you know, and it definitely represents where we were at that time. I was surprised, actually, to notice and hear it myself a lot more other influences that, you know, I had at the time. I wasn't really conscious, maybe semi-conscious of at the time. Like a lot of the riffs on the record sound, you can definitely hear like influences by Helmet and things like that. I mean, Helmet had kind of taught me how to play guitar, you know, when I was like 15, and there was a lot of that in there, and you know, even the guitar song was quite Helmet-y as well. It wasn't just like Iron Monkey, I Hate God, Worship. It had a lot of that as well, which kind of surprised me looking back on it now. If I could get to do it again now with a different production, I certainly would, but I'm fucking 25 years older and wiser as well, and been around the block a few times. So yeah, it was like where we were at right then, and I think it's like a document of that time of the band, you know. And in retrospect, probably prouder of now than it was then when we first released it.